Welcome to issue 2 of Geek Shop. Today, me and Chetan are talking about stories, specifically how we write stories for comic books. So, let's take a walk to the Geek Shop. And welcome to another episode, or another issue of Geek Shop with my friend Chetan. Say hi, Chetan.
Hello.
So today we're going to talk about story. So I think story is sort of the bedrock of of comic books, and it's sort of the base of where everything lies. Every medium, I think every visual artistic medium tells a story, but I think comic books tell it in a different way. If you look at it, you think about it, detail is sort of how it works. Painting has less detail in the story. Animation has more detail in the story. Comic books sort of fits squarely in the middle. So what do you think of that assessment?
I agree. Comics is the perfect tool, I guess, to tell your story.
Yeah,
I mean, you could go on. It's a great medium because you could tell a story visually, or you could tell it in all text and have spot illustrations. There's so many options in a comic book.
And we can get into this later, but it would be. This could lead to a conversation of defining what is a comic book, but I think, that's for another issue later. But
that's going to be another 5-hour episode.
Yeah, special 5-hour live stream. We'll
Yeah.
So I agree that it's definitely it's designed specifically to tell stories too, whereas other mediums they do sort of tell a story, but they weren't specifically designed to do that. So I think that's an important part of comic book history.
Oh yes, I agree. It's fun because it gets your imagination thinking. It's like, one thing about if you're writing and drawing your own story is it gets your brain thinking, so much that, hate to say it, if you sit down and started, for me, for example, if I sat down and started drawing, if I didn't have a day job and didn't have a mortgage and all that stuff, I'd be doing comics all day.
Yeah, it's true. We should talk about, we're going to talk about storytelling and specifically sort of how comic books, the story is conceived and written for comic books. But we should talk about, there's some general terms that go around the comic book world. I think the most common one is called Marvel method. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Like the different methods that happen? In particular, we can start with Marvel method.
Yeah, from what I remember, as a teenager, I used to look up, reading interviews with artists and writers and stuff and how they draw their comics and everything. And the Marvel method, there used to be Marvel and DC method. And the Marvel method was more of a plot style. They would just describe the scene page by page, and the artist would come in and use their imagination and draw what the writer wrote as a plot, but it leaves it open for the artist to add things to it. Mm-hmm. And once the stories are drawn, the writer will come in and script it.
So it's more of an interpretation that then leads to, like, notionally the story could completely change, because I've definitely sent stuff where I've even sent a script into somebody, and then you get something back, you're like, well, that's an interesting story, not what I wrote, but that's definitely an interesting story.
Yeah, that is kind of different. In a script style, the writer writes down everything in detail, even the dialogue, everything. Where in a plot style, it is much looser. So I think it depends on the artist. Some artists will interpret things differently. Some artists would want everything laid out for them, but when you write a script and someone comes in with something different, I'm surprised on that.
Most of the time it happens, and I'm totally okay with it, because, I think my ego is enough that I'm like, this person came up with a much better story than I did, so I'm okay with that. The basics are there, but sometimes, I guess it's more like, probably when it's your own story, because I've written stuff where I don't draw it. And when it's, I think it's when it's my own story, I have an exact idea of what I want, and so when they deliver something different, I tend to sort of go a different direction with it. So, try and sort of, extend where it's, I have a different thought in mind of where the story is going to go, because I have a clear vision in my head. So when somebody presents something different, it might seem a lot different to me. So
So on sometimes the changes could work out in your favor, and other times it could be the opposite. So it's it's a gamble. But
Yeah.
the plot style, Marvel plot style, I know Stan Lee used to, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and all those guys. They just, from if I remember, a lot of times in the old days, they just talked about the story. They didn't even, I don't know if they wrote, written anything out on paper. I think they were verbally just say, you know what, Spider-Man beats up Doctor Octopus in this issue. He's robbing a bank, and the
Yeah.
writer would go and develop the story. But later, I think it came more in detail, page by page, what the plot's happening.
I think talking too is different than writing. Like if I was to write down a couple of paragraphs and say, okay, make this comic book, you would get sort of a different feel than if you and I were to sit down and say, oh, I've got this idea for a comic book, and we were to like have a 20 or 30-minute conversation about a comic book. I think you get a different feel for it. So I think Marvel method probably works really well if you're able to have communication, be it by telephone or in person with the person. Whereas I feel like maybe if you're further away or separated, you might want to have a more detailed plot.
And especially in those old days where, only way you could get hold of a person would be phone call if they lived, let's say, you know, across the world,
Yeah.
where plot style,
Yeah, so
if you lived in New York City, you could just talk to them or phone them. Nowadays, we have the internet and stuff; we could talk to everyone. But I've drawn stories both plot style and script style, and to be honest, I don't have a favorite because it depends on the writer. Because some, like you said, some writers will make it loose even in a script style where they keep it loose for the artist to change or add things to it. Other writers, sometimes when I'm in one of those lazy modes where I just want to draw, don't even think about the story,
Yeah.
the full script works perfectly because all you have to do is just visualize the story, do your thumbnails, do your finals, and that's it. Where
Yeah.
sometimes you want to get into it and think about the story and say, okay, I want to be more involved in it.
Yeah, I've heard stories of like Alan Moore. Apparently, his scripts are like insanely detailed.
Oh yeah, take a look in. I have one of the Watchmen hardcovers, and his I think panel one description is like, I can't remember how, half a page or a paragraph.
Yeah,
You know, but then again, it's Alan Moore. you know. But then again, I've heard that a writer like that also lets the artist be more creative also. So I don't know how much of that is true, but you know, you know, look at Alan Moore and look what he produced. I mean,
yeah.
if he could write that much, then you know what, let him write it.
And I think some artists like that. I think some artists don't want to have to sit there. Well, I don't want to write this thing. I'm looking at making cool drawings, and so they're not interested.
I think that's it. Yeah, because you know what, if you sit down and start trying to think out the plot, how to plot out the storyline and everything, it's an effort, and some people, not I don't mean it in a bad way, but again, they just want to draw, like you said.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. There's definitely. I remember working in animation. There was some animators. You'd be like, "Do you want to direct? Do you want to work on this in more detail? Do you want to get into that?" And they'd be like, "No, I just want to animate this thing. Like, I want to take a character and make them do what they're supposed to do in the storyboard." And so I think that there are artists out there who just don't want to focus on the overarching plot or even the details of the plot.
So mentioning that, let's talk about you. How do you plot out your stories, and how do you write yours?
I would say my comics are probably more along the sort of DC level, in that I definitely, there's a lot of writing that involves. I do write a script for every single one of my comic books. I would show a picture of the text on the screen, but literally it's just a Microsoft Word document. For Blue Orchid right now, I actually had a basic story arc written for chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I've known sort of where the story is going to go till chapter 4. Like my first collection, my idea is to make chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 the first collection. And so I've known what that story is going to be since the beginning. I've had a few little changes here and there, but in general, I've had the complete story arc since doing chapter 1. I knew where chapter 4 was going to end.
So do you roughly plot out the start, middle, and the end?
So for
Or
that,
do you have it in your head?
for that, I actually I have a paragraph for each chapter. So I sort of had what each chapter was going to cover and roughly how it was going to do, like really rough, like one paragraph, just as a basic sort of.
Just a simple idea, yeah.
Yeah, so in this chapter, we're going to meet Blue Orchid. She's going to fight a monster, and we're going to learn about her powers. In this chapter, we're going to learn about, in chapter 2, I'm just finishing up right now in coloring and stuff. That's when you're going to find out about her past, her parents, her grandfather and stuff. The next chapter, you'll find out about, the villain is the main character in the 3rd chapter. And then the 4th chapter is sort of the conclusion of it all. So I had that written like early on. And then I took the paragraphs and I would write them out, and I would literally sort of think about pages. So I think in the first page, she's going to be fighting this monster. In the second page, she'll be doing this, and so it's basically I'd break down what would be in each page. In some cases, I'd put dialogue in, or at least an idea of what I wanted the characters to say. But for the most part, it's pretty loose. It would only be like, a few lines, about 4 or 5 lines each page. And then I would sort of break it down. And then after that, I can show you there real quick. I have my sketchbook where I have, and I'll post a graphic up, really loose drawings, like super loose drawings, just like a sketchbook, and I do each and every page. So one of the things I like to do about storytelling when I'm doing it, particularly for comic books, but also for animation, is I almost it's not that I rewrite it, but I allow myself to make changes as I go along to sort of improve things. So I'll pull out pages when I'm sort of doing my sketchbook version. I'll add pages if I need to.
So you're not completely detailed in stick to this type of what we were talking about earlier, where stick to the script, type of thinking.
I mean, I have to make sure that it sticks to the script enough because I'm going 4 issues of a storyline, so I can't.
No, but you leave yourself wiggle room inside in case if you need to add certain, plot elements or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it would. The thing is about my rough sketches, these ones, is for the first issue, they were super detailed. They were more detailed. Like I would put in shading and everything like that. And then I can show you. I'm doing my latest story, which is chapter 3, and you can probably barely even see it. And even when the scans barely see it, it's like stickmen. So I think the more I got used to the characters and the storylines and stuff, the more I've really loosened up on this stage of my storytelling. So now it's just like I don't expect anybody to be able to have to look at this and actually make sense of it except for me. So I'm the only one that has to be able to make sense of it at this point. So the story just has to be clear. And I have to make sure that, because sometimes I find when I'm coming up with stories, I have an idea. It's like, oh, well, at this point, the monster will be afraid. And I'll be like, so what does a monster look like afraid? And so in this point too, I'll sort of in my rough sort of doodle, I'll doodle out things, and sometimes this is where I'll also do bonus sketches too. So I'll do side sketches of like, okay, well, this is how this monster's going to be afraid, and I'll try different things to try and make it better. Sometimes too, depending on the story, and the current one I'm working on, which is chapter 3, which I'm roughing in right now, I'm almost designing the monster as I'm writing this, as I'm doing this part of the story, as I do like the thumbnails and my rough pencils, because I find that this is there's only a certain amount of poses you actually need for your monster, and so rather than sit there and make this hugely detailed version of every design of my monster, I realize all I have to do is show the parts that are applicable to the story. And so I tend to design the monster at this point too. I'll do a few side sketches, but particularly in the rough pencils is when I start to really design my monsters or my enemies or the secondary characters for...
See, that's funny you mentioned that, because when I'm doing my thumbnails and story, I do the same thing on the side. I'll start doing sketches of what I'm, the story.
Yeah.
What I have in mind for that panel or that character. I'll do a drawing of, him or her or whatever, and later on I'll refine it later.
Yeah. I'll actually hold on one second. I actually have I'll have side pictures too. Like this is the monster for chapter 3, and so I keep a sketchbook to the side, and it's just like if I sit there and I'm like I haven't quite figured this out, I'll just do a bunch of doodles on a separate sketchbook, just because my margins particularly with my when I'm writing a story, my margins are small to none, because sometimes I'm cramming it into a sketchbook, so I'll just do it on a separate page.
Yeah.
So, and I tend to do it. Actually, it's funny. Chapter 2, I actually wrote in Procreate because I think I was on an airplane, and I was just like the idea, like the details sort of came to me, and I was like, okay, and I just started drawing it out. So it's like it's whatever I can do. So sometimes it's a sketchbook, sometimes it's a bigger sketchbook, smaller sketchbook, everything like that. So then after that, I tend to go to rough pencils, where I will still make changes sometimes, like particularly because I'm actually starting to actually have to draw it out and figure out how this thing's going to work. So sometimes I'll zoom in a little bit more or go wider a little bit more.
And sometimes things that are in the script and the sketches and the thumbnails don't work out in the final pencil.
Yeah, although
so you have to change it.
Although I hope my hope is that with the rough pencils, at least the way the story arc goes, it's figured out. Like, because by that point, I don't want to be like, oh my God, this isn't working at all. So by this point, I've gone through the story by the the rough overarching story, the script for that particular one, and then the thumbnails. By the time I'm finished with thumbnails, I should have a pretty good idea of my layout and where my story is going. I have added and subtracted a page here and there, but it's pretty rare.
Okay, that's good. No, that's good. That's an interesting method of drawing.
Yeah, it's
writing and writing. I mean.
Yeah, it's. I tend to find though I have to have some words to start with. Like I've never been able to just go with the story immediately. Like I don't think I've ever done no script in my entire life. So I don't think I would be like afraid to give it a try.
That's what I'll talk later with me.
Yeah, that intimidates me. I think it depends on the story, on the character you're doing too. Because I think one advantage you have with TikTok Tom particularly is it's a little bit surreal. So if you kind of get a little weird, that's okay.
Yes.
So whereas Blue Orchid, I try and keep a little bit more grounded. Like there's no real, I mean, there's magical and there's superpowers, but there's no like alternate dimensions or, things that you can really just get wacky with. It's like the difference between a Superman story and a Doctor Strange story.
Yes, and yeah, you're right. And you don't have a talking pigeon that's smoking also in your book, so you can't go completely crazy.
Exactly. I mean, and we can get into this when we talk about how you do stories, but one of the great things about your story and the universe you built with TikTok Tom is because it's surreal and because it lends itself to so many different styles, and even it can get into the sort of weird. You can have multiple people working on it, and you don't have to worry about them sort of being like messing with your universe too much if they get too weird or not. Because I mean, there's some very weird TikTok Tom stories.
Oh yeah.
And it works, but it works because
it works.
The
That's
base
the
you
key
gave your
part.
characters where there is this sort of surreal.
Yeah.
So I don't have that gift. I don't have that luxury because with mine, I don't think there's going to be time travel or anything weird like that. Like, again, because I have the overarching story, I really have to make sure that all my ducks get in a row for every storyline I'm doing.
That's it, yeah.
So, and it's like I said, different method, but it works for me. And but even when I write TikTok, when I do TikTok Tom, when I'm doing like even something weird like that, I tend to plot it out pretty heavily before I even do it. Even one pagers, I'll write a script for one page of comic books.
Oh wow.
So, but yeah, why don't we? I mean that's the basics of my writing style. Let's talk about yours.
Years ago, when I first started, like any other creator, any teenager who's looking into comics and stuff like that, I read lot of articles. This is before the internet, so buying magazines, comic magazines, and all this, and seeing how writers write their stories, how artists create their stories, and all this. And I've tried the Marvel plot, tried the DC scripts, tried everything. And after years and years, I kind of came up with my own method, and I'll show you a sample. This is how I lay out my comics usually. And what I do is I used to, and this is before, what I do is I don't write out full scripts anymore. What I do is I sketch out the, I know it's hard to explain, but I roughly have a plot in mind. I'll write down notes and stuff on a piece of paper and stuff like that. Then what I would do is take I used to use these templates that you could buy in comic stores, comic templates. But over the years, I made my own templates. Lay it out, make a scan a comic page, make out my templates, have areas to put notes in, and actually, I'll show you one page of that. That's this one here.
Cool.
And so I'll make up my own templates. On this side, I'll write out the rough plot. And what I do is generally start drawing it out as how I'm going to draw it out. If I'm drawing it or someone else is drawing it, I will, plot out, let's say 5 pages of it. And then roughly write out a, description, what's happening on the side. And it's one of those methods where it's kind of backwards, where I do the sketches first and write out the plot on the side.
Yeah.
Because that's my creative process. Now, one of the other guys, I think it was Tom, Tom Yo, we were talking about, writing out full scripts, doing full thumbnails, doing full pencils, doing full inks. And I hate to say it, I don't have the attention span. In between writing the full script and drawing the final pencils, I'm bored. So that's my thinking is, you know what, just go to the page, start drawing. And what you mentioned earlier, I have done before, where I just taken a blank sheet of comic page and just draw out panels and start filling in the panels. And get the, no plot in mind, just start drawing and write the story as I draw. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but when it works really well.
Yeah.
Now, most of the artists I've worked with, example, Tom Yo and I've worked on one of our books, this one here. It's our 600-page book, where Tom and I did almost, crazy, yes, Tom and I did almost 500 pages of stories in it. And some of the stories in that, I did it this plot form, and I gave it over to Tom to draw. Sometimes Tom would draw his own, but this is a method that's worked for me, and I realized when I work with artists, they like that idea also, because it gives them a rough, I will sketch out a plot on paper, thumbnail sketch, and he or she will go and interpret what I drew, what the side notes, and sometimes they'll add things that I did not expect. And Tom's very good for that. It's like, wow, I didn't even think about that.
For drawing stuff that you would not expect, and it's always awesome.
That's it, and he'll take something from the plot and change the story, and I'm going, thank you, I wasn't expecting that. So that's where it's my process is in between, I would say, between Marvel plot method and the DC script method, where, for me, if I'm personally drawing it, I will, like you said, sometimes it'll be detailed, like if you look at this page and this page, one's really detailed and one's not. It depends on the mood I'm in.
Same way.
It depends on the mood I'm in when I'm sketching it out. Sometimes I'm like, you know what? I need to know exactly what's going on the page. When I'm plotting it out.
Me, it also
depends.
Sometimes for me, occasionally it'll depend on where I'm actually writing it. So if I'm on the bus writing it, then it'll make a big difference over what if I'm, sitting at home on my desk writing it.
Well, see, for me, it's it's sometimes even a slight stick figure, or when I come back to it in a couple of days, I know what's going on that page. Other times I'll look, and other times it's worked out the opposite, where I'll look at the stick figure and go, what was I planning to do with this? But you know what? It's over the years I've kind of figured out how I my method is, and it seems to be working now.
Yeah.
I hope so. I mean, I hope you guys, people reading our stories are enjoying it, to make it,
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, I've lasted this long, so I hope so.
Exactly. But, you've got a fan base.
But the bottom line is, you know what? Find your own way of writing a story and drawing it. If sometimes artists need writers to help them out, and which is great. But if you're writing and drawing your own stories, you know what? You don't have to do it the traditional way. Do it the way works for you. And you know what?
Yeah.
No one's going to care. Only thing they care about is the final product.
Yeah. Although your mental health might be important, and sometimes it's nice to get other people to help you.
Oh yes, no. But I mean, sometimes, and I mean, if sometimes if you're just doing your own stories, you know, you know, don't be locked into saying, I have to do it this way because you know, you know, DC Comics said I have to write a story this way. You don't have to
Yeah,
write it that way. Do whatever works for you. I mean, mind you,
exactly.
if you're working for Marvel and DC, yes, they will have their own way of doing it. So you might have to, go
Yeah,
by their rules. But
that's
when you're
true.
doing your own books, who cares how you write it? Just do it.
Okay. So, I mean, it's interesting how your style is definitely, your style of writing affects your story. And I think storytelling is going to be a big part. And I think it's going to be something we're going to talk about a lot in this series forever. I think that's going to be part of this whole thing, Geek Shop experience.
Oh, I think so. And storytelling, honestly, again, there's no right or wrong ways of doing it. Bottom line is just do it. And you know what? Even as years goes by, things I change my method a little bit. I'll change it and tweak it, take out things. It's it's always evolving.
For sure. So I think we'll wrap this episode up. Just make sure if any, I'm gonna tell, I'll say this to everybody watching this. If you have any ideas about things you want to talk about as far as the comic making process, maybe beyond storytelling, we have other ideas as well. But we are going to be continuing talking about story for the next little while, and maybe again in the future. But if you have other ideas you want to learn about how to make comic books, drop us comments. Let us know what you're doing. If you have a comic book, if you do use something, anything like that, drop a comment because we want to hear from you people. So, Chetan, what do you want to talk about? What are we talking about in the next episode, do you think?
Next episode, we will be continuing talking about how to create comics, writing. We'll get more detail into more. Sorry, continue in the writing process.
I think so. That's the base of comic books when you start. Even if writing isn't words, I think the base is always, storytelling and how to get that story started. So, thanks for watching. And Chetan, what do you want to tell these people?
To be continued next issue.